Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this live session, Practical Advice for Successful SBOM Management. You know, if you're confused or frustrated or just a bit unsure if your organization is handling software bill of materials the right way, you're in the right place, and you're not alone, because SBOM requirements and regulations are still evolving. So a lot of people are feeling the pressure and want to make sure they're doing the right thing. So in this session, we really want to offer some clear, tangible advice you can use and answer as many questions as you'll throw at us in the time provided. We may run out of time to answer all your questions live, but we won't leave you hanging. We'll follow up with an answer afterwards. So please submit your questions in the question panel. Let me introduce our speakers and I'll get out of the way. We have Russ Ealing, founder of OSS Consultants. OSS Consultants works with companies to understand the risk of using open source software and helps them define a management strategy to address them, offering OSPO creation, OSPO as a service, open chain conformance, and of course, SBOM management. And actually, the Linux Foundation, they recently published a great case study highlighting their work with BlackBerry to implement an enterprise-wide OSPO and apply the open chain ISO framework. So check that out. And we also have our own Tomas Gonzalez. Tomas is head of our North America operations at FOSS ID and oversees our customer success team, which includes providing upfront solution architecture, onboarding, and continuous support of our clients using our software composition analysis tooling. They use that to inventory their third-party software usage and generate SBOMs. You can see a wide range of the global brands that trust our SCA tooling by visiting www.sca.ninja. Yeah, you heard me right. That's sca.ninja. So, all right, enough about us. Russ and Tomas, let's go ahead and get into the first question. First question is, who needs an SBOM? So help us understand, is this more for suppliers, importers, customers, vendors? Tell us about this one.
Sure. I'll take a first stab at this one and then pass it on to Russ as we go. It's amazing. This is still a question that we hear a lot. And to start by setting a little bit of context, when we talk about SBOMs, we're referring to a list of components. So think of it like the ingredients in your food, but for software. And beyond the ingredients, we also have some metadata for those components that track the provenance of those components, such as their authors, as well as their versions. So you can think, as we dive into SBOMs, we're talking about SBOMs as a summary of the pieces of code that make up an application or the services that make up an application. And this concept has really been around for a long time. SPDX, one of the major recognized standards for SBOMs, has been around since 2011. And it shares common roots with manufacturing processes that are really trying to understand the supply chain of the software that they incorporate. Recently, we see the resurgence of this question because SBOMs are at the center of legislative compliance. And most clients, when they ask us this question, this is what they're thinking about. It's becoming a requirement. Particularly with a focus on vulnerability. So, for example, the U.S. Executive Order 14028 or the Department of Homeland Security Software Supply Chain Risk Management Act, these share a common goal of mandating the production of an SBOM in order to help IT teams report or respond to incidents, particularly around security vulnerabilities. Similarly, in the EU, that even though there are localized efforts in certain countries like Finland and Germany that require production of SBOM, the big one you hear about is the CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, addressing the issues of vulnerabilities that lack timely updates and users really needing to understand these vulnerabilities and who they can rely on for help in order to inform incident response. Beyond vulnerabilities, SBOMs are increasingly an integral part of software supply chain to enable transparency and incident response. So to wrap all that up start answering your question, Aaron, like SBOMs are relevant to anybody and anywhere where there's a software buyer-vendor relationship. Russ, you work with a lot of clients on SBOM production. How have you seen this manifest in your world?
Yeah, they really are relevant anywhere there's a software vendor or buyer relationship. As you said, if you happen to be in the middle of a supply chain in that model, you might supply more to more than one OEM. For example, you might have one supplier with different OEM customers who have different requirements. So this has led to some pretty interesting scenarios. Some have asked to see snippets of code listed on an SBOM. One supplier we worked with had to provide SBOM in SPDX 1.0 versus 2.x versus Cyclone DX for basically the same product, which can be difficult to manage. Let's add to that the licensing declarations. So some require it on an SBOM, whereas others, it can break their machinery or their processes to have additional fields, for example, because they haven't accounted for those extra fields. We've seen some OEMs that have specified tooling types, for example, SCA versus binary scanning or package analysis, which can then add another layer of complexity depending on what tooling you may have available to you. For software that lands on an embedded device, again, it's best to be prepared in the very likely event you'll be asked to provide an SBOM. So we would advocate for a more granular SBOM in the case of embedded devices. It might be important in these cases to generate a source SBOM. That way you're prepared if you happen to be, or if you're asked to provide one. Another important consideration with embedded or IoT devices is knowing what got shipped at a granular enough level, since these devices can then be difficult to update after they're shipped. For software that might be deployed into a broader application environment, you could make an argument that a source SBOM is potentially less critical here because most application environments would be using mostly still packages and dependencies, but it's still important to declare all dependencies and components, not just the top level.
Yeah, it sounds like, and thanks for us, it sounds like those who really need SBOMs are software vendors to demonstrate transparency that they know what's in the software they're shipping. It also shows that they understand and they're willing to stand behind what they're providing as a supplier. A software consumer who might use the information in an SBOM in order to inform incident response as well as potential vulnerability remediation efforts. Anybody that's playing in a regulated industry or a regulated geography to where the production and supplying an SBOM is now a requirement to doing business. So it sounds like anybody who needs a better understanding of their software supply chain should be thinking about producing or requiring an SBOM as part of their software shipping or purchasing. This is a question we hear a lot. I hope that was informative. Aaron,
Good
back to you.
stuff. Thank you. Very good. So moving on to the second big question people tend to have. What questions does an SBOM answer? So I have this SBOM document. Now what do I do with it?
Yeah, this is also a surprisingly popular question because if you think about the SBOM outside of the realm of just meeting the compliance checkbox in order to transact in a particular geography, for example, an SBOM really informs many use cases. A lot of them revolve around the common topic of risk management. They help various teams make decisions about procurement or also continuous operation of software in the context of vulnerability remediation or incident response. But before I continue, Russ, in your experience, like what answers can an SBOM provide?
Thanks, Tomas. So I think an SBOM can answer, and it's not often used for this. I think we're seeing some growth in it, though. So an SBOM can often answer license compliance questions. So there still isn't broad consensus on whether to include license data in SBOMs or not. And sometimes it comes down to who you're talking to. So perhaps license compliance might appear to be less important if you were in a security role. That said, those that disagree with license compliance being part of an SBOM may still be forced to produce this data if it becomes a requirement from their customer. So this is why we still recommend having the metadata that Tomas spoke about earlier associated with your cataloged open source use. So if you need it for SBOM, you already have it. If you don't, then at least you have it for other needs, such as license compliance. An SBOM can also help answer what's in your software. So it's critical to understand your inventory. Before we get into the specifics, let's talk a little bit about knowing what's in your software and your software inventory, because inventory is critical for many reasons. And maybe this also ties in with the trust and transparency aspect as well. So cataloging, which we've mentioned already, so knowing what software you're using, it's important to note where that software is used. So in which products, to which customers, clients, maybe how it was used, perhaps as a standalone library, which might be important to know from a license compliance perspective. When it was used, so in which releases and in which months and years, because you may need to upgrade a version at some point. And when you do, it would be good to know when that change was breakpointed. So basically, without an inventory, you don't know what you have or what you may not have. For example, log4shell. You might not know where something was used or how it was used. So how does that relate to SBOMs? So SBOMs enable trust and transparency. But to do that, you need to be able to identify your use of software and then be able to report on it, like in an SBOM. So you can't do anything about the open source you're not aware of. So you can't comply with it, you can't secure it, and you certainly won't be able to accurately report on it. If you know your code and have the kind of inventory data or catalog that I just spoke about, then putting together that SBOM becomes that much easier. So many organizations are often stuck at, how do I know what I'm using? So, don't get me wrong, if you have a customer requirement to produce an SBOM, I'm not saying to go build a catalog first. Definitely address your immediate need, but a longer term goal should be to work towards a full catalog of what's being used, how it's being used, and where it's being used. Tomas, any other use cases?
No, I think the key piece that you mentioned, you kept going back to, is so important. This aspect of building a catalog and really understanding what's in the software that you buy or that you build or that you're running in your environment for various reasons, license compliance being one of them, absolutely, since it informs many go, no-go decisions on whether or not software can be used. But also dependency health is one. The information in an SBOM can help developers really understand the components in use in an application. It gives them visibility into dependencies that might be out of date or potentially unsupported, which introduces a maintainability risk. Like an SBOM can definitely be a source of insight for informing decisions on whether or not these components are viable for longer term use, as well as vulnerability management and incident response. This is the one we hear about a lot these days. Like an SBOM can inform decisions around ongoing operations of software for not only the detection and the identification of vulnerabilities, but also for allowing better triage and remediation planning, in the sense that if you have an SBOM for a particular piece of software, you know how that software is deployed. What is critical severity according to the National Vulnerability Database might not necessarily be critical severity for your environment because of the way your software is deployed, other controls you have in place, other network restrictions, or just overall the results of a threat model that you ran in your environment. The data of your SBOM can inform whether or not this is something that needs to be actioned. Beyond understanding the impact of a vulnerability, there's also the aspect of support. Like an SBOM, particularly having that catalog with the provenance metadata, can help teams understand who they need to reach out to or who they rely on for support of a particular vulnerability. Is it an open source vulnerability, or is it a vulnerability in a commercial component? The SBOM can likely point teams at who they need to reach out to in order to, request remediation or mitigation assistance. An SBOM can also help in crisis communications. If you, at the time of shipping your software, produced an SBOM and there were no vulnerabilities associated with that with any of the components in your software, and suddenly there is, because you have that SBOM, you now know, okay, like I have this component, a new vulnerability was disclosed for it. Who's running this version of my software? I need to reach out to them and let them know that there's a vulnerability in the software, as well as what actions are going to come from it. So there's an interesting aspect to crisis communications among partners, affected organizations, and customers during, but also following an incident. All in all, these are all answers around trust. Like what's in an SBOM can provide confidence in the security, the licensing, as well as the dependency health of all your products. And as a vendor, that can help you demonstrate to the people you supply to that what's in your software and you're acting in their best interest. All in all this information we're talking about is really part of a foundation. Like the SBOMs themselves don't tell you how to act. The SBOMs provide the foundation for the answers and around which you can build processes. So what we want to do is really think about, you think you alluded to this, what is the question that you want to answer with an SBOM, and then kind of figure out what information needs to be in the SBOM in order to better answer that question. Imagine a fantastic scenario you mentioned Log4j. Imagine when Log4Shell or even Heartbleed were disclosed. Like if there was a complete map because we had SBOMs from multiple sources that really helped understand the dependencies and their widespread impact, we would have been able to really understand the impact of such a vulnerability much faster, instead of still finding out to these days that there are systems, embedded devices, and just overall hosts out there that are still running vulnerable versions of OpenSSL. An SBOM could have helped provide insight into the widespread impact of such a vulnerability.
Awesome. Anything else you guys want to add to that question? I think that was pretty good. Want to move on to the next one?
I'm sure that's not an all-exclusive list. But.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. No, I thought that was really interesting about the crisis communication angle as well. But let's go ahead and jump into the third big question that we have. How do industry leaders create SBOMs? So can you share some examples of what maybe I'll call mature SBOM adopters and what they're doing?
Sure. Tomas, I'll take this one, or I'll start with this one. So some of the best examples I've seen are from those that have done a great job anyways with being both complete and accurate. Some examples at the other end might be well-formatted SBOMs with very little content, or at least very little accurate content. I already spoke about the concept of a catalog, so I won't rehash that. But there is the concept of data or metadata, like Tomas and I have both spoken about already, that's associated with your software that you may feel doesn't need to be reported until it does. So why not begin this journey, your SBOM journey, by being prepared for what may potentially come as a future requirement? So I'd encourage you to not limit your solution to the requirements facing you today. Licensing data, for example, may not apply to you today, but it could in the future on an SBOM. So allow for provisions in your process today so that you're prepared for tomorrow, even if it isn't a requirement today. So it likely could be in the near future. We're seeing several organizations receiving this requirement. Some organizations have procured a tool. They've set up the basic configuration. They've plugged it into their dev processes and crossed their fingers. So how much do you trust that source of data? Some tools have better results than others. Some tools are used for purposes they weren't designed for. For example, trying to complete a source SBOM when your tool only scans binaries. So how do you know that your tool caught everything, or that it potentially incorrectly identified software that you're not using? So it's important in this aspect to select a tool that fits your purpose. Another industry-leading practice is to future-proof your SBOM by doing more than the minimum so that you can scale. Some organizations structure their SBOM operations to meet the current requirements, as I said previously, and then they don't consider the impact of the potential future requirements, like the licensing aspect. So application or package level scanning may be acceptable today until a source SBOM is required. Again, the concept of a catalog resolves a lot of this, but it's not an easy lift. It's a big lift. So it's okay to start small, but it's more important to start somewhere, even if that means only producing a package level SBOM until you can get to a more comprehensive process in place. But what you don't know can harm you.
That's such a great and important call out, Russ. I had to kind of write it down to make sure to double click on that. Is this concept of doing more than what is mandated or what is required. So what I'm hearing is that the professionals at SBOMs are proactive as opposed to reactive. See what I did there? But if you think about it, the NTIA minimum requirements, which is what you see everybody asking about, like, will this SBOM help me meet the NTIA's minimum requirements? These are a starting point. And for some organizations, as you said, it's great to start with those requirements, but you should really be thinking about how you can do more than the minimum. How can you plan for questions that you're going to be asked in the future? How can you figure out what are the sources of information, of accurate information you need to provide in order to answer them? This is how the pros think about it. And an extra note on this point of accuracy, you mentioned it again, but I want to double click on this point. Consider what we discussed around the different answers that an SBOM can provide. It's not just about the data in the SBOM. It's about the decision making that comes downstream after ingesting that SBOM. What processes can you inform based on those decisions? Like, really, the action that the SBOM inspires is only as good as the data it contains and the accuracy of that data. And with that, there are risks in data inaccuracy. If you have the wrong name of a component or the wrong version or a wrong unique identifier, such as the Perl or a CPE, you might end up with false positives. You might end up with false negatives. And you alluded to this. How do you know that your tool caught everything, or if it correctly identified software that is or isn't in your code base? So all in all, to say, like, this focus on accuracy is paramount so that you don't lead yourself or anybody that relies on your SBOM for any of the use cases that we've discussed toward a false sense of security. So one of the things we encourage, as Russ mentioned, if you plugged in a tool and you operationalized it, you integrated into your SDLC, and it's now producing reports, audit your SBOM. Like, verify what is in your SBOM versus what's in your package manifest, for example, as a starting point, and make sure that the information in your SBOM matches what you know to be there. And if it doesn't, then it might be a gap in the tooling or something more suspicious going on, where a package that you ship is not what matches your manifest. But also thinking of the process. Again, there's many different tools that can produce SBOMs in many different formats that are all conformant to these minimum requirements. And see how you can, with the end question that you want to answer in mind, how can you structure those SBOMs, make sure they contain the information that they require, being proactive, again, thinking of the questions you might be asked in the future, so that you're not just producing a software bill of materials. This is a Rust coined term here, but instead a product bill of materials or device bill of materials, depending on what it is that you're shipping or what it is people are getting from you. So Russ, I hope I did some justice adding on to what you initially mentioned around how the pros do it.
Definitely. Thanks for that.
Yeah, there's a lot. We covered 3 questions, and there's a lot to unpack. So if I could give you an opportunity to recap and summarize what you took away from those 3.
Yeah, I'll take this recap. So for number one, there is more pressure from industry and regulation to maintain SBOMs as a requirement of doing business. So this is in relation to the question of who needs an SBOM. Again, anybody that plays in an industry or regulated environment or involved anywhere in a software supply chain, as a producer, as a consumer, you generally want to be thinking about how you produce and also ingest and use software bills of materials. Number two, we talked about the questions that software bills of material answer. Like, it's really important to start with the question if you want to think about it as the use case for your SBOMs, and then work backwards from that use case, because different SBOMs serve different purposes and might have different levels of completeness of the data that they contain, because they're purpose made to answer certain questions. So really consider the outcome of the SBOM you're trying to produce. Don't just produce an SBOM to produce an SBOM. And then number 3 is standards and best practices are still ever evolving. Generally, it is safer to do more than the minimum. Again, you can start at the outcome. What question needs answering? And then ensure that the data in your SBOM is accurate and complete to answer those questions. Once you have that design done, what the professionals do, they systemize the production of that SBOM, automate its creation. You can do it manually, but do you really want to do it manually for every release of your software? Sounds like a lot of work. So that's how I would summarize a lot of what we've discussed today.
All right. So, kind of where do people begin? What should they be thinking about? Let me throw this one over to you guys.
Sure. It can be beneficial to have a directly responsible organization that's governing your use of third-party code. For those perhaps unfamiliar, an OSPO, or an open source program office, it's an organizational structure within your organization. Sometimes it's a formal part of your organization. Sometimes it's a little less formal. So OSPOs also often own or at least oversee open source policies, processes, approvals, etc. So if you have one, an OSPO could be a great resource to utilize for managing SBOMs. OSPOs typically already manage inventory of software to some degree, so they often become a logical choice for helping to manage SBOMs. For those unfamiliar with what an OSPO does, an OSPO typically would serve as the center of open source expertise within your company. And again, it can be an ideal solution if you need a scalable method to manage and track your company's use of open source. For tools and processes, you want to make sure your tools and processes enable you to generate SBOMs. The only way to scale your SBOM efforts is with tooling that covers all of your organization's needs, alongside with an efficient process that allows you to identify and report on your software usage. And it's important to ensure your SBOMs are both accurate and complete. As Tomas and I both said repeatedly throughout this presentation, you need to understand the potential for false positives and for false negatives. So accuracy is super important here. Component names, version ranges, unique identifiers. You don't want to lead yourself or anyone you provide an SBOM to a false sense of security.
Good stuff. Thanks, Russ. All right. I think that wraps up the big 3. And we're right on time to take some questions. So again, everybody, if you have a question for Tomas or Russ here, enter it into the question panel. We have some time to field a couple. And I do see a couple right now. So let me pull up those questions that I got. I got 2 so far. So the first one says, yeah, I get that you need to include open source libraries in your SBOM and third-party commercial libraries. But I've some say to include your proprietary code as well. How do you define your code and include it in your SBOM? Isn't that redundant? Where do you draw the line on what should be included. So to kind of summarize, we've got open source, you've got commercial third party, you've got your own proprietary code. How do you determine what's the scope of your SBOM and what goes in there?
Yeah, Tomas, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start this and then you can tag on
Go ahead.
if you have additional thoughts. Yeah. So, I mean, for us, normally we're looking at what the requirements are and who they're from. So this will most often at least inform, if not answer that. So it's still a good idea, as we mentioned, to catalog your own code. You may not need to disclose its use if it hasn't been required by your customer or your end user. Otherwise, it's still a good idea to catalog it. It may not be required to report it. Again, requirements are important to follow here.
Yeah, that's really important to mention, Russ. The requirements will largely dictate. And the question of whether or not to include it relates to the use case. What's the question you're trying to answer? What decisions are you trying to involve? In terms of dependency mapping and understanding what pieces of code rely on what libraries, including proprietary code that has been assembled into libraries in your SBOM, can help developers understand the impact of a particular dependency and all its related subdependencies. Now, there's one nuance in this question that I think is really interesting, and putting a proprietary library in your SBOM does not imply disclosure of source code. This is something that a lot of people are kind of concerned about. It's like, does this mean I have to disclose my code? It's like, no. You really want to just say, hey, I built this library. It's proprietary. It's mine. It has my own license. I included it in this particular piece of software because, as I've already covered and Russ already mentioned, it's part of the information required to inform a lot of downstream decision making. But it doesn't mean you have to disclose your code by including proprietary components in your SBOM.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Okay, good stuff. The second question I have for you, this is more of a DevOps question, it looks like. We have a lot of industry pressure to ensure our SBOM is complete and accurate, but also more pressure to release new builds faster and more frequently. How do you recommend balancing these pressures or automating as much as possible when it seems the results also need manual verification?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the scaling problem. I think the short answer is here, you need to have the data cataloged or baselined is another way to put it. That way the incremental changes from release to release, especially if your releases are frequent, which sounds like this is the case, it's generally not a big undertaking to stay on top of. I mean, there's a whole lot more involved with doing this, but it's not something we're going to cover in any depth during Q&A. High level, that's Tomas, any other thoughts?
I think you nailed it. And one of the things that you mentioned towards the end in the recap of having a directly responsible organization within your company that owns or at least oversees the production of the SBOMs really helps eliminate this friction point in particular. Where I've seen this friction point manifest the most is when people are pointing fingers trying to figure out whose responsibility this is. And if you have a system and a process and a governing body and policies and procedures for the production of the SBOM, it becomes normal part of release due diligence instead of something that has to be thrown back and forth and people trying to figure out who needs to be owning this part of the process. So very valid question, very real for a lot of people, but something that, particularly Russ and his team have a lot of experience helping organizations make sense of this chaos.
Hey, a couple more questions have come in. I'll read them in the order they came in. So the next one on deck is SBOM automation realistic at all if there are no package managers in use in the projects?
It can be. Yeah, I mean, it can be if there's still other third-party software in there. And there, again, if you have a catalog of this, it doesn't mean it has to be all packages or dependencies. I don't think there's any limitation around only declaring packages and dependencies. Yeah, certainly that is automatable.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I
Cool.
would agree with what Russ is mentioning. That's a question of what tooling are you putting in place to automate the production of the SBOM. If your tools only work on package managers, then yes, you might run into this limitation.
Mhm.
But if you have tools that can detect and process and identify anything that's unmanaged, which is the case, this is very tech stack dependent, of course,
Yeah.
then you can definitely build the catalog of unmanaged dependencies in your code base. Absolutely.
Cool. And yeah, so there could be a lot of nuance in that answer. Maybe that's something we can follow up offline about and dig a little deeper, poke at that one a little closer to see if we can help some more. But the next question is, I have the impression that most SBOM tools are for SBOM producers. How would a consumer of SBOMs keep track of all of them?
Also a challenge. We're starting to see this especially over the last year. The last couple of years, people have been focused, as you mentioned, on producing SBOMs. Now it's like, what do you do with it? Often this requires additional process as well. There's a lot of considerations here, formatting, so SPDX versus CycloneDX, content, all the things we mentioned earlier. So, yeah. Tomas, any other thoughts there?
No, I 100% agree. Like many of the tools have historically focused on production of SBOMs since that's where the starving crowd is. We need to produce an SBOM in order to meet XYZ requirement or answer XYZ question. In terms of what comes after, as Russ said, this is still an evolving area. There's a lot of variance in tools that claim to do SBOM management. But the silver lining is that these popular formats for SBOMs are machine readable. And a lot of what comes after you ingest an SBOM, if you have a clear understanding of what are the questions you're trying to answer, then you can parse and extract and transform and do all sorts of cool things with the data in that SBOM in order to arrive at being able to answer those questions. So while you might struggle to find tooling that helps you answer every single question that we covered today out of the box, yes, there's a lot more concentration in tooling to produce SBOMs. There is a silver lining in that there's standards and they are machine readable. So start with what question are you trying to answer, and then see how you can massage the data in the SBOM in order to arrive at those conclusions.
I love that reminder of it. It's you have to start with what questions you are trying to answer before you try to jump to a solution. But that's a tough one for the consumers. But yeah, the standards truly help how they're being built out. Got another question for you guys. Another good question. What are good practices and tools to handle an increasing number of SBOMs? On the one side, there are different SBOM states for one release. On the other side, there are new releases. How do you keep track?
Russ, you want to take a stab at this one, or you want me to?
You go ahead. I'll tag on.
I mean, I'll take an initial stab based on my interpretation of the question. And if I didn't hit the nail on the head or land anywhere close, please follow up. I'll be happy to continue this one because this is a really interesting topic. Like, there's many types of SBOMs. You heard Russ allude to, for example, source SBOMs. There's also build SBOMs. There's also design SBOMs, runtime SBOMs, analyze SBOMs, deployed SBOMs. And these have all been defined by the NTIA. I'm not making this up. And this is where, again, it's kind of important to think about what is the question you want to answer. Like, think of a vulnerability response scenario. You have a source SBOM that has all the components that were identified in your source code. You have a build SBOM that has a complete list of all the components that were pulled in at build time and later compiled into the final deliverable. You have a lot of information there, potentially 1,000 vulnerabilities across 100 components. Now, let's say you have a runtime SBOM, because you have a tool that instruments your application at runtime and can actually tell you what was loaded when the application is in a running state. And ideally, that runtime SBOM is a subset of what was in your source and your build SBOM. While your source SBOM and your build SBOMs are very helpful for things like dependency health and compliance, being able to work off that subset produced by a runtime SBOM, for example, is going to give you a much more targeted area of what vulnerabilities should I be looking at based on what's actually loaded in a running environment. So yes, there's a multitude of SBOMs. Yes, it becomes difficult to maintain them all as new software is released. But just like the components in the SBOMs themselves can be versioned. And so it's really knowing what's in your environment. And then based on knowing what's in your environment, you then have the SBOM or the component inventory that you need to be looking at in order to assess what are the answers to the risks that you're trying to mitigate or avoid. Russ, what do you think?
The only thing I'll add to that, I mean, that was excellent. The only thing I'll add to that is the importance of having the right process in place, and that process is going to be unique to your organization's needs. So there's efficient ways to do things, and there's complex ways to do things. Hopefully, you have an efficient process for this, because this is obviously going to be a growing, I don't want to say problem, maybe a growing concern, is that people are going to be inundated eventually with SBOMs that they have to combine at some point. So again, think about scale, not just the requirements today in front of you, but the future requirements, and ensure you have efficient processes. As Tomas mentioned, happy to take this offline as well, to continue the conversation if you want.
Awesome. Well, guys, Russ, Tomas, thank you so much. I think you've knocked out all the questions the attendees could throw at you right now. And again, attendees out there, if you think of something later, we are happy to field questions. You can throw something at us. You have my contact information, but you know how to find us. Yeah, that's everything, and we're good on time, so we will wrap it up. If we didn't get to your question, again, if you come up with something later, or if we feel like maybe there's something we can go deeper on some of those questions we fielded, we may ping you and see if we can be of service and help dig into that a little more. Hey, but that's it. Thank you for attending, and have a great day, everyone.